Welcome to MVD Apologetics. Today I will be talking about, was Apostle Paul an egalitarian? Now, I'll use these two words, egalitarian and complementarian, a lot in this video. I reckon you search them up, pause the video, search it up right now just to understand what the terms mean. Without further ado, I'm going to go into the video. What prompted this question? For many of you, obviously, if you've read a lot into Paul, you would know that he is very clearly a complementarian on this topic. But I had a friend who sent me a reel, and the reel is by a guy, his name is Caleb. I think Caleb Sullivan, something like that. And Caleb, he does this little skit where he pretends to be Apostle Paul arguing with someone with apparently like a right-wing take of complementarianism in the modern day. I believe he strawmans Paul's position completely, and we'll get into that. But that's essentially what happens. He pretends to be Paul and to justify an egalitarian view of the headship of a husband. So without further ado, let's go into the video.
The Bible says that the husband is head of the wife, so he always gets the final say.
Yeah, you were taught that, but that's actually anti-biblical.
What? But that's literally what the scripture says.
No, that's what modern hierarchy says, not the Bible.
Okay, then explain the verse that says that the husband is the head of the wife.
Yeah, in my world, the word head, Kephalē, didn't mean boss. It meant source or origin, like the headwaters of a river.
So you're saying that no authority at all was implied in that?
Authority was already assumed over women in Roman culture. I didn't need to command that, but what I was doing was subverting that.
Subverting it how?
I told husbands to love their wives like Christ loved the church. Not rule, not control. Die.
Okay, but what about Genesis where it says that he will rule over you?
And that's not a command, that's a curse. And we spend our whole lives undoing other curses like painful childbirth, cursed ground, without calling that rebellion.
Huh, I see what you mean, so why keep the other one?
Exactly.
So where does power show up for men?
It doesn't. Jesus explicitly said you are not to lord authority over one another.
So men were never given power over women?
Only responsibility to love, serve, and lay down their lives.
I'm sure if you've come across the reel and you trust everything that Caleb had to say, I'm sure you can find a convincing case that Paul was an egalitarian. But let's dive quickly into the core claims he made and look into each and every one. And these are the claims here, I've written them down. First, that headship of the husband is anti-biblical and it's actually imposed and introduced by modern hierarchy. The second is that the head in Greek, Kephalē, doesn't carry the English connotation of boss/authority. And I want you to notice he used the word boss in the reel because boss also carries the negative connotation of your work boss and doesn't actually imply authority. So, a bit dishonest from him there. But he also claims that the better translation and connotation of the use of Kephalē in the context of Ephesians 5:23 is the word source. And the third claim, Ephesians 5 does not reform the Roman patriarchy which existed at the time, but instead actually subverts it and eliminates this patriarchy. And 4, Genesis chapter 3 verse 16 is a curse and not establishing an order and therefore shouldn't be maintained. Agree, but I want to bring that point up because he used it in a dishonest way, but we'll get into that. And 5, Jesus forbids lording authority generally, and then he draws the implication for marriage specifically. The question is there a hermeneutical leap there? Now, let's dive into each and every one, starting with the first. Headship of the husband is anti-biblical, and it is by modern hierarchy and not the Bible. And right off the bat, the headship of the husband is not anti-biblical. It is mentioned explicitly across multiple epistles, Ephesians 5, 1 Corinthians 11, 1 Timothy 2, and it's also implied in 1 Peter chapter 3. That itself is two authors writing independently. So the question is, if headship is just a modern hierarchy which is imposed onto the Bible, you then have to explain how Paul and Peter, who were living in the ancient times, both arrived at that same conclusion of headship. And anyone who's dabbled even a little bit into politics can understand that this is actually completely backwards. The truth is that the complementarian view is the historical consensus. I'm talking about Augustine, I'm talking about Chrysostom, I'm talking about Aquinas, Calvin, I'm talking about the Westminster Divines. Each and every one of them read headship as real authority. The egalitarian view is actually the modern one. It was emerged in the 20th century alongside second wave feminism. So we could see right off the bat that this cultural pressure runs in the complete opposite direction of what Caleb claims. And to add another layer to that, Paul does not justify and ground his view of headship of the husband in culture at all. You read in 1 Timothy chapter 2, he explicitly says his reason is because Adam was formed first. So what Paul does is he reaches back before any and every culture and points to creation order to justify his view on headship. This is the complete opposite of cultural imposition. So we conclude, headship of the husband is definitely not anti-biblical, and it is definitely not introduced by the modern hierarchy. In fact, I would say that the case is way stronger in the other direction, where we could say the egalitarian view is one that is introduced by modern hierarchy. But anyways, we move on to Caleb's second point. Caleb claims that Kephalē doesn't carry the English connotation of authority, and that the better connotation is the word source, or the meaning source or origin, as he says in the reel. Now, at first, that actually sounds plausible, but a simple minute or two of research would show that it doesn't hold up to scrutiny. And the two ways we go about it is lexical evidence and contextual coherence. Starting with the lexical evidence. Wayne Grudem, an American theologian, he surveyed over 2,000 uses of the word Kephalē in Greek literature. When used metaphorically in relation of a person to another person, it consistently carried the idea of authority or leadership, not source. The source meaning does appear, but it appears specifically in literal usage, such as the head of a river. But when the word Kephalē is used to describe relationships between people, the meaning of source essentially disappears. The example is cited by scholars such as Payne and Fee, and this is where I suspect Caleb got his view from, but the examples cited by these scholars, they refer to either literal rivers or rely on heavily debated translations. So now the burden of proof is on anyone who claims that Kephalē means source in a relational context. And I believe that clear and unambiguous examples are just going to be extremely difficult to find. Now the next part when addressing Kephalē and its usage in Ephesians 5 is the contextual coherence. So let's grant for argument's sake that Kephalē means source or could mean source. It does not fit at all in Ephesians. In Ephesians chapter 1 verse 22, in the same letter, Paul says that God placed all things under his feet and gave him as head over everything. And that is explicit authority language. The same word Kephalē is used here in head. So if Kephalē means source in chapter 5, you then have to explain why the same author in the same letter uses it with unmistakable authority language in chapter 1. And there is no reason for us to think that Paul is switching meanings mid-letter. So to put it simply, the source interpretation doesn't fit the lexical evidence or the context. Kephalē means authority. The question is, what kind? Now we go into Caleb's third claim, which is where he claims that Paul was so countercultural in commanding husbands to die for their wives that he dismantled male authority altogether. The thing is that when we look at the text, this doesn't actually survive for too long. Because if Paul's goal was to eliminate male authority entirely, why is it that Ephesians chapter 5 verse 22 still says, "Wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord"? Paul had every opportunity to drop the submission language. Instead, he keeps it and redefines what the husband's role looks like. That is not elimination. Instead, I would call it a reformation. And the analogy present in Ephesians 5 makes this even clearer. Paul doesn't say Christ-like love replaces headship. He says the husband is the head of the wife as Christ is the head of the church. Here we can see that headship is the premise and sacrificial love is what flows from it. And Christ's headship, as Ephesians chapter 1 verse 22 makes clear, involves real authority. And as we know Christ, we know that his love and authority coexist, and that is explicitly the model that Paul is holding up in Ephesians. Next is Caleb's claim that Genesis chapter 3 verse 16 is a curse and therefore shouldn't be maintained. And he's correct, he is right, Genesis 3:16 is a curse. But what he has done is defeated a position that nobody actually holds. Complementarians do not base their view of headship on Genesis 3:16. Complementarians view it as a curse as well. And I challenge him to find a serious complementarian theologian or a reformed confession or any mainstream complementarian resource that grounds headship in Genesis 3:16. And you will not find one. Instead, you'll find that that verse, Genesis 3:16, is read as the distortion of headship, not the basis for it. So what Caleb did here is he knocked down a position which nobody holds. That is a straw man fallacy. So does the complementarian view borrow anything from Genesis? Yes. In fact, it is pre-fall, before Genesis 3:16. We look in Genesis 2, before the fall, before the curse, before sin. Adam is created first, Eve is created from Adam and for Adam, described as his helper. The Hebrew word Ezer. And then we read that Adam names her. In the ancient world, naming someone or naming something carries authority. In fact, we see it in the previous chapter. God names what he has authority over through Genesis 1. And all this is pre-fall with no sin and no distortion. So Genesis 3:16 doesn't invent headship. Instead, it takes it and corrupts it. It takes servant leadership and then turns it into domination. And you'll notice Caleb, he captioned his reel as I believe it was you can't dominate and save, which, by the way, is a false dilemma fallacy. And this is why the redemption argument, where he mentions pain from childbirth, actually cuts in the other direction. Because undoing the curse means undoing domineering rule, which is exactly what Ephesians 5 calls husbands away from. What it doesn't mean is undoing a creational structure that existed before there was anything to redeem. And this takes us to the fifth and final point, where Caleb claims that Jesus forbids lording authority generally, and therefore this should apply to marriage. Now, with this claim, there are three problems. First is the hermeneutical leap. Mark chapter 10 and Luke chapter 22 address the disciples arguing about greatness and correct the model of Gentile political domination in church leadership. However, here, Jesus is not addressing marriage when he forbids lording authority. If we were to take that principle and plant it into the marriage structure, we require justification. And to note, when Paul writes Ephesians 5, he doesn't cite Jesus on servant leadership. He reaches for the Christ and the church analogy, and that is not an accident. The second issue is the Trinity. In John chapter 14, Jesus says, "The Father is greater than I." The Son submits to the Father. Does that mean that the Father is lording authority over the Son? Nobody argues that. The Son is fully God, equal in nature, dignity, and worth. Yet, he submits functionally. So here we could see that authority and equality of being coexist in the Trinity without contradiction. Reformed theology uses this as a direct template for marriage. So equal in dignity, differentiated in role. So you can see it's a problem when Caleb says that authority has no place in marriage, because now he's arguing against a pattern that exists within the Godhead itself. And third and final, Caleb is conflating domination with headship. Jesus forbids lording authority, which is the crushing and controlling domination model, and complementarians agree entirely. That's in fact the Genesis 3:16 curse. But forbidding the abuse of authority is not the same as forbidding authority itself. And as history has demonstrated many times over, the answer to abused authority is not no authority. In fact, it's authority exercised rightly. So we conclude, Caleb's argument rests on 5 claims and none of them hold up. Headship is not a modern imposition, it's the historical consensus grounded in creation order before any culture existed. Kephalē carries authority in relational context, and Paul uses it that way in the same letter. Ephesians chapter 5 reforms the character of headship, it doesn't actually eliminate the structure. The submission language alone makes it very clear. Genesis 3:16 is a curse, agreed, but the actual foundation is Genesis chapter 2 before the fall entirely. And as fifth point, we can clearly see that Jesus forbidding domination, which we can see, is not the same as Jesus forbidding authority, which he doesn't do. In fact, the Trinity demonstrates that authority and equality of being coexist without contradiction. So the through line across all these 5 points are the exact same. Caleb ignores the distinction between headship as God designed it and headship as sin distorted it, which is domination. He argues against distortion and presents it as if he's arguing against the design, and he calls it a biblical case when it is not. And to conclude, Ephesians 5 is not a passage about power, it is a passage about covenant love, a husband laying his life down for his wife as Christ laid his life down for the church. That in and of itself is a high and expensive costly calling, but it is a calling that assumes a structure. And definitely not a calling that eliminates the structure. Anyways, this is MVD Crucified with Christ. Like and subscribe. Ciao.